If Conor McGregor returns to MMA, he will have a technical advantage. Here's why.
Now, for those in attendance and UFC fans watching around the world.
Unfortunately, Conor McGregor's leg got jacked all the way up in the McGregor-Poirier 3 trilogy at UFC 264. But if Conor McGregor comes back to MMA, he will have a technical advantage against his future opponents.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Stay tuned and I'll tell you why. Hey interns, I'm Dr. Chris Rainer and I am not your everyday ortho. I teach you about injuries, orthopedic surgery, and medical topics in a way that's easy to understand and entertaining. Today, I'm going to show you what factors contributed to Conor McGregor's injury, and more importantly, why I believe that he will have an advantage over his opponents if and when he comes back to MMA. If you think you know when Conor will return, put that in the comments below now. Stay tuned to the end of the video to see how McGregor's injury was different than Chris Weidman's. With that being said, let's get to it. Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier faced off for the third time at UFC 264 on July 10, 2021. In this meeting, the stage was set as the final leg of a fight trilogy that had had each fighter previously victorious over the other. This was the fight to determine which of the two was the true champion. In this fight, Poirier was positioned by odds makers as the likely winner, but only by a narrow margin. In their previous outing on January 23, 2021, Poirier had won in the second round by technical knockout. In that fight, Poirier focused on nullifying McGregor's offense with a barrage of calf kicks. Once McGregor was immobilized by the attack, Poirier was able to finish him off with a series of punches, 2 minutes and 32 seconds into the round. McGregor, who was unhappy with the loss, wanted an immediate rematch with Poirier to avenge his loss. The fight was scheduled for July 2021, and McGregor trained for 6 months to prepare himself for the fight. It was reported that McGregor was intently focusing on preparing for the fight and was determined to be victorious in this third meeting. Many were anxious to see McGregor's strategy for the fight and to learn how he planned to deal with Poirier. And the viewers did not have to wait long before they saw what Conor had planned for the meeting. McGregor came out firing on all freaking cylinders, with 2 spin kicks blasted in Poirier's direction in very quick succession. He followed with 2 roundhouse kicks, the first of which connected on the outside of Poirier's knee. The next 2 kicks included another roundhouse to the outside of the knee, which Poirier instantly acknowledged, and a teep kick to the abdomen. At this point, it was clear that McGregor intended to use the same weapon to defeat Poirier that Poirier had used to defeat him 6 months earlier. All in all, not including knees, McGregor threw 22 kicks during the match, 8 of which were hard roundhouse kicks to the thigh or to the outer knee. 7 of these roundhouse kicks came prior to McGregor's attempted submission on Poirier. Only 2 kicks came after the combatants exchanged on the canvas, a roundhouse kick to the thigh and the final teep kick. As McGregor stepped back from the teep kick, McGregor's lower tibia showed a subtle deformation. Then, as McGregor stepped back to throw a cross, the end of the tibia collapsed and McGregor fell to the canvas. From the deformity, it was clear that McGregor had suffered a combined fracture of the tibia and fibula at the junction of the middle and distal thirds. Fortunately, McGregor did not also suffer a laceration after having stood on the deformed lower leg, which would have elevated the severity of his injury to another level. McGregor was transported to Cedars-Sinai Hospital in LA, where he underwent operative fixation of his fractures on July 11th, the following day. His fractures were treated with an intramedullary nail for the tibia and plate and screw stabilization of the fibula. Even though we don't have his x-rays available for review, this fixation combination confirms a few things about McGregor's injuries. First, the intramedullary nail for the tibia confirms that the tibia fracture was more than 5 centimeters above the ankle joint line in the shaft. So no Daniel Cormier, the ankle itself was not directly involved. The fracture deformity suggested that this was the case. Fractures that are closer to the ankle joint require plate fixation rather than nail fixation, as the nail cannot be stabilized appropriately with less than 5 centimeters of intact bone. Second, both bones were involved in the fracture pattern, since both bones were stabilized separately. Plate fixation is the standard approach for stabilization of fibular fractures, while intramedullary nail fixation is the preferred technique for stabilization of uncomplicated tibial shaft fractures. But what we can't discern from the fracture is the type of fracture that occurred. For this, we have to look to the mechanism of injury. The deforming force most closely associated with the final fracture is a rotational moment as McGregor attempted to step into the cross. As I have said many times before, Bones are great in compression, but they absolutely suck in rotation. The fact that rotation was involved in the completion of the fracture suggests that Conor suffered a spiral oblique fracture of the tibia, the most frequent fracture pattern associated with a rotational mechanism of injury. However, the mechanism may not have been so clear-cut, and it may have occurred in several stages. The question on everybody's mind is, when during the fight did the injury occur? I would like to acknowledge my colleagues Steve Mora, Corey Callandine, Michael Perkowski for their insights in discussing this injury online. While the most obvious injury occurred when McGregor stepped back for the second time, the true injury occurred elsewhere. There are two other clues that give us more information about the moments that contributed to the final injury. Immediately after getting back to his feet, McGregor fires off a roundhouse kick that strikes Poirier in the outer thigh. This is the 21st kick that McGregor has thrown in the first 4.5 minutes, and the 8th roundhouse attempted in the fight. He successfully throws a teep kick immediately afterward and then steps back. After having watched the replay several times at 1/4 speed, it becomes clear that when McGregor threw the roundhouse kick, there was plastic deformation of the tibia on contact. This is the term used to describe a bone that bends without fully breaking, but then returns back to normal. This can occur in the context of an intact bone, or in the context of a bone that has broken on one side, but not the other. Then, after stepping back following the teep kick, it is clear that there is more plastic deformation of the tibia. Both of these episodes suggest that the break was present prior to the roundhouse kick after the ground melee. Based on this information, I suspect that the break involved only a single cortex of the bone when it occurred. So, what other opportunities were there in the fight for the break to occur, or at least to be initiated? My colleague has suggested that the initial injury may have occurred when Poirier blocked a teep kick with his forearm, potentially striking McGregor on the shin with his elbow. However, after reviewing that sequence several times in slow motion, I'm not sure that the contact occurs with the end of the elbow, and I suspect that the contact was more with the forearm than it was with the end of the elbow. A forearm strike would be less likely to cause the injury that we observed, as the forearm would be the weaker of the two bones in that interaction. Others, including Poirier, have suggested that the injury occurred with one of the first roundhouse kicks to the outside of Poirier's knee, when Poirier pointed to McGregor's leg. However, this sequence, when reviewed in slow motion, shows that McGregor contacted Poirier's knee with the top of his foot, not the tibia. So although Poirier may have seen or felt something on impact, this was not the moment when the injury occurred. When the footage is reviewed in slow motion, it does not appear that there were many instances where the injury could have occurred. So, if not during the fight, when might the injury have happened? Joe Rogan noted that McGregor's coach Kavanagh commented after the injury that McGregor had suffered an injury to that leg while training for the fight. They thought that he may have cracked the tibia, with McGregor even going for a scan for it, which to my knowledge was negative. They had even consulted an orthopedic surgeon in California in the weeks prior to UFC 264, but nothing significant had been found. Perhaps there was an injury that had just gone unnoticed. So what are the factors that contributed to McGregor's injury? In my mind, there are 4 factors that contributed to McGregor's tibia fracture: his pre-fight training regimen, his fight strategy, his kick selection, and the overall animosity with Poirier. 3 of these factors are closely linked with one another. After having been dissected by Poirier with kicks in their second fight, McGregor and his team made the conscious choice to use high-powered kicks as an integral part of their strategy. Within only a few seconds of the start of the fight, McGregor had already released a barrage of kicks, half of which were targeting Poirier's legs, and all of which were coming with freaking heat. This was clearly the strategy coming into the fight, and is likely something that was practiced frequently during the training camp leading up to it. Prior to the fight, reporters had commented how intensely McGregor was training in preparation for the rematch. Training would likely have included many thousands of kicks on the bag, the pads, or directly on training partners. The fact that McGregor and his team suspected a tibia injury in the weeks prior to the fight speaks to the possibility that McGregor was indeed vigorously training in accordance with this strategy. Thousands of submaximal strikes with the tibia against a bag or pads in a relatively concentrated period of time, approximately 6 months, could certainly weaken the bone and cause a stress fracture in the tibia. However, the other factor that was intimately associated with the first 2 factors was the kick selection. With 22 total kicks being attempted in the first 4.5 minutes of the fight, the strategy involved using McGregor's legs as much as it did his hands. Of the kicks that were delivered, 1/3 of them were roundhouse kicks that were delivered forcefully to Poirier's legs. These kicks, much more so than the other kicks employed, caused the tibia to be subjected to bending forces, with a potential seed of injury being placed during the months and weeks leading up to the fight, and the nurturing of that seed with the kick selection and the repeated roundhouse kicks during the first round of the fight. The eventual result was the fruit of the fracture that occurred 20 seconds before the end of the first round. The final factor that may have played a role in the injury was the animosity, real or manufactured, with Poirier. McGregor has always been quite brash and never one to steer away from confrontation in his exchanges with his opponents. However, there seemed to be a heightened level of personal enmity between McGregor and Poirier. If this were real and not a planned performance purely for entertainment purposes, then it is possible that McGregor let his emotions run rampant and he put a little something extra on his kicks. Of course, the goal is always to incapacitate your opponent with kicks like this, and so typically they will be delivered forcefully at their target. However, if you truly hate your opponent with your every fiber, then you are going to want to put a little hot sauce on them just for good measure. Did Poirier get in McGregor's head and force McGregor to overexert himself? I don't know. It is certainly possible. So with all of that being said, what do I think happened and why do I think McGregor will have an advantage when he returns? My suspicion is that McGregor likely suffered a stress fracture while training prior to the fight. While not enough to incapacitate him, it was enough to elicit a medical examination and to affect his training afterwards. With that injury in the background and the game plan selected for the fight, it was only a matter of time before the inevitable occurred. As I said earlier, bones are great in compression, but they absolutely suck in rotation. And unfortunately for McGregor, they are not that great in tension either, especially if you repeatedly try to bend them over your opponent's thigh. The repeated blows over the distal shin caused the gradual propagation of the stress fracture from one cortex throughout the tibial shaft. Successive roundhouse kicks caused the plastic deformation of the tibia, further weakening the bone. The final push-off while throwing the cross added an element of rotation to the mix. And voila, tib-fib fracture. McGregor's fracture was stabilized with an intramedullary titanium nail, a rod that is placed down the center of the tibial shaft, and a plate screw fixation of the fibula. This is the standard technique for fixing fractures of this type. Titanium is used because it has a modulus of elasticity that is similar to that of bone. And that just means that it bends and deforms similarly to bone. When used to stabilize a tibial fracture, it functions as a load-bearing device until the fracture is healed, at which point it becomes redundant. And this just means that technically, after surgery, you could walk on it normally without fear that the bone would break. However, once healed, it is still in the bone. So it does offer an element of protection against further fracture. In fact, because its modulus of elasticity is so similar to that of bone, it's kind of like having a tibia inside a tibia.
Like a taco within a taco?
A double-decker taco supreme.
When you think of it that way, it just might be a secret weapon that McGregor will have in his back pocket when he returns. In my opinion, in the future, it will take a lot more heat than what McGregor was cooking up at UFC 264 to damage that leg when he returns to competition. And why was McGregor's fracture different than that of Chris Weidman? I have talked about Chris Weidman's injury in another video, but based on the information that I have at hand, it would appear that Weidman's fracture was a fluke injury that occurred as a result of the manner in which Uriah Hall checked his kick. It does not appear that it was associated with a pre-weakened tibia that might have been conditioned for injury with a stress fracture. McGregor's injury, on the other hand, seems to have been the culmination of a series of events and decisions, both conscious and unconscious, that set up the perfect storm for his injury. A training regimen that led to a stress fracture before the fight, a fight strategy focused heavily on kicks, a kick selection that repeatedly subjected the tibia to repeated tension forces. Sounds like
He needs some milk!
to me. But in all seriousness, I wish the Notorious One well on his recovery, and I can't wait to see him back in the octagon competing once he is recovered from his injury. So that is why I think that McGregor will have an advantage if and when he returns to MMA in the future. Thanks for watching. I will see you for rounds next week. And as always, that's been a word from Dr. Chris, not your everyday ortho.
Just a flesh wound.